I call to order the second session on terrorism and the Constitution, a framework for action. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been listening this afternoon to interventions, very valuable interventions, by several high-level speakers about democratic security in a time of extremism and violence. I'll make some comments on those points, but not before thanking our dear friend and colleague Ismail Serageldin, who served by distinction, with distinction, as the Director General of the Alexandria Library. And as part of his very effective endeavors, we see seminars, roundtables, conferences, debates about lively issues and problems that do affect the international situation, international community, currently, and also has to do with the future of our international community. I also wish to seize the opportunity to thank my friend Rafshan Muradov, the Secretary General of the Nizami Janjavi Council, who, with his activism and very kind approach to people around him, has succeeded in creating a new spirit within this cultured community and succeeded in positioning the Nizami Janjavi institution in the center of the activities, international activities, in the cultural field, and also in discussing many of the current international problems. I thank both, and I believe that all of you join me in thanking the library and the Nizami Janjavi Council. Now, the session has 6 speakers and 90 minutes. I will introduce the speakers, and they have been introduced through the papers. We have a speaker from Egypt, Judge Tahani El-Jibali. We have a speaker from Croatia, President Ivo Jovivovic, President from 2010 to 2015, and President Amin Jumail, President of Lebanon, 1982-1988, President Peter Stoyanov, President of Bulgaria, 1997-2002, and Dr. Abdelaziz Twegri, the Director General of the Islamic Organizations Cultural Organization. Our rapporteur will be Mrs. Heba El-Rafai, Director of Public Relations, Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Ladies and gentlemen, the title, Democratic Security. This would perhaps raise some questions about the viability of the title itself. And I believe that this title should be interpreted in clearer terms, which is a question: how to save democratic process, rule of law, freedom, at a time of extremism and violence. Extremism that embodies terrorism and the malinterpretation of principles of religion and the misinterpretation of thoughts, of literature, including, as the President of Serbia referred this afternoon, not only those half-educated people, but the so-called extremely educated people who called for clash of civilizations. Not necessarily called for in the literal sense, but they put this issue on the table. Clash of civilization with a special reference to Islam. Those who called for the end of civilization according to certain rules, regulations, that's it, nothing else is viable, also contributed to the protests of other cultures. That why? Why is this? Why should this be considered as the end of history, as if we had no contribution and no future? So, when we talk about combating terrorism and extremism, it is not only through education, although it is necessary for succeeding generations to be aware of the right and wrong, and not only through violent reaction by governments, by societies, but also through discussion, clear discussion with those that claim to be highly educated, and yet they provoke nasty discussions, nasty confrontation among civilizations, and express kind of feeling that we are better than you. And what have decided will determine the future of the world. We have to have an argument with them, as we should have argument with others that are plenty, especially in this part of the world. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in this session, the paper before you has raised three, I would say four basic points that are put on the table this afternoon for discussion by the panel right here. The first one is, or says, fundamental rights should be guarantees even in periods of so-called war on terror. That is the first point that has been raised. The second one determines that broader powers to the security forces to allow them to move swiftly under conditions of imperfect knowledge argue from fear of the consequences of delayed action. This is a position taken by a certain current in the international, in the regional, and in the internal public opinion. A third point would counter this one by stating that we might be facing a slippery slope that would eventually lead to curtailment of civil rights and fundamental freedoms. Then comes a school that puts before you a kind of compromise that takes from all the previous points and positions. What about expanded surveillance and judicial review, as well as extraterritorial cooperation in investigation, in policing, in prosecution, and in planning for the future in that very field? This is the issue before us. Indeed, I would say that we have to be firm against terrorism, against violence, against crime, against extremism. But we have to do that within an acceptable framework and educated, in accordance with educated plan. Now, I give the floor in the order I have been told to use. First speaker is Judge Tahani El-Jibali, former Vice President of the Supreme Constitutional Court in Egypt. I give her the floor. Judge El-Jibali, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr.
I would like, first of all, to express my deep appreciation to Alexandrina Bibliotheca to hold such meeting under this shocking title, the security of democracy. We thought that democracy would be the solution, but it looks like that there is a synonymous meaning for the word democracy. The world today should understand what are the repercussions of democracy, what does it mean to destroy and demolish countries, and the respect for the weak. And we reach the level now that the world today needs innovative and creative thinking style. The world today also needs intellectuals who should shoulder the responsibility to face the core reasons and the main reasons for destroying democracy. It looks like that there are a lot of threats that we have here, and such reasons, we cannot talk about the reasons of democracy demolition without having, or we cannot talk about extremism as well without considering other cultural and political and the social aspects as well, and the economic reasons, and also the legal aspects. We should also consider what is the stage the world nowadays is facing. Here we are talking about the mechanism of values. We are talking about the principles and the values that could represent the stage and the time and the era after World War II. And also the attempt of the humanity and the mankind to develop and build up countries, and also building other developing institutions and organizations that can help in pushing the world forward, and also to protect the human rights, and also the UN Convention. After passing all of these years, we are nowadays in a worse situation, probably worse than previous decades. The question that we have here today that I would like to raise in front of all of you is, how can we examine the problem without considering the diagnosis of and the main reasons for the problems? We should understand that the concept of democracy is based on the popular participation and also the civil rights. And we should also consider it's correlated, the democracy is correlated to the social aspects And the intellectuals in our community should understand and should also shoulder the responsibility according to the UN conventions, and also consider the life and the political rights, and also talking about the economic and the social aspects. Here we are talking about the stage of building the international community that was based on conflict and that ended after that or in the Cold War. So such a previous state did not have any kind of inclusive social or political aspects, but it should go exclusively and by force into a different stage that can help, and it should be included in a political entity, and also should be sponsored and supervised by the superpowers. So any violation for the rights of these countries should not be considered like a title for protecting democracy. And even if we have some super or major powers in the world that they could initiate invasions or invade other countries, so we can see that in this region there are a lot of reasons that could affect the concept of democracy. And such concepts could threat at the end the meaning and the value of democracy inside countries, which cannot be based on sectarian diversity or sectarian divisions. So this regretful situation, this current status nowadays, should push all the intellectuals and all the cultural people to go forward and to think about a world conscience. They should also understand how to build awareness and how to respect multilateralism or the multi-thinking styles and the diversity and the respect of differences that could be creative, that could be innovative, within the entity that can help to develop or to create a variable cultural development. Do we have the courage to face this world today? This world that did not tolerate the racial segregation in South Africa, and also to start a new stage for the African continent that was based before on the racial segregation and racism. So this world today looks intolerant in a racist society like in Israel that is based on ethnic and sectarian divisions, and such country that is still practicing a sense of division and racism in a region that is full of troubles and problems. And so the region at the end could be based on such differences and such conflicts. Do we have the courage to face the problems and the double standard issues that could achieve the minor political gains for some countries? Do we have the courage to face such a challenge in order to consider the rights of and the birth rate for humans and for humanity to take its right back and to get the right to move forward without fabricating the values of the society under any title like democracy. And because of such superpowers are stronger, then they are pushing their agendas. I think that this is the challenge that we are facing nowadays, and we would like to face during the time of extremism and terrorism. Extremism is not just a number of fanatic groups. It's not just armed committed violence, but they are also sponsored by intelligence agencies. They are sponsored by major powers in the world in order to achieve their objectives and their ends. They would like to formulate again the world into a new order, and in order to create this a sense of absorbing the natural resources for such countries. We cannot talk about this issue without having the intellectual confrontation, first of all. I think that this is the bottom line of our talk. And let me just say that we are proud to say that Alexandrina Bibliotheca is considered as an important beacon, as a significant center in the world, among different cultures in the world. And we are proud to see that such Bibliotheca is facing such challenges. One of the strategies that this Bibliotheca is applying is to sponsor and we would like to see important figures like you and like other participants. We would like to hear, we would like to listen to all of you, to those people who would like to talk about freedom and democracy without any kind of discrimination, and those who respect the poor, respect the weak. There is no need to be poor all the time and to be deprived of your rights, but there are social rights that should be protected. And I hope that my words, I hope my speech is not shocking to all of you, but I hope that it could open a channel and a new stage and a new attempt to formulate and to form the world. And we cannot formulate the world again without having a new thinking styles and without having to face the intellectual aftermath and the consequences that we faced for a while, and rejecting also the unipolar power and also respecting the diversity, which is the core point of democracy. By doing this, we will be able to face the thinking styles that can push to criminal acts at the end.
أشكرك
Well, thank you so much.
السيدة تهاني الجبالي.
Thank you so much,
ولا أعتقد أن
Mrs.
كلامي
Al-Jubali.
صادم
I
من
don't think
مقال
that your words and your speech is shocking, but actually you are asking for having new and innovative and creative thinking style to face the challenges and to protect the human rights. Since the Declaration of the Human Rights in 1948, so today the world in a worse situation, it's in a difficult situation, and we are facing challenges that could overcome the components and the main pillars of the states. And this is the role that we are facing nowadays. And the speaker also talked about the intellectual confrontation and also the World Cultural Project sponsored by Alexandrina Bibliotheca. I think that such international project still has a lot of steps, and I wanna thank you. Now let me just give the floor to Mr. President, the former president of Croatia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, allow me to thank you and the organizer, Ismail, for opportunity to say a few words about contemporary terrorism. Today, leaders of democratic countries should really be worried whether the history is going to remember them as someone who successfully faced with terrorism, saved democracy, life, and stability, or the history is going to remember them as dictators who took advantage of terrorism to kill democracy, diminish human rights, and turn democratic society in a rigid and repressive society. If we compare terrorism from the beginning and mid of previous century and 21st century, we have to understand that that's not the same terrorism. There are very significant differences. Firstly, some characteristics of terrorism from the mid of 20th century. It was mostly individual or in small groups. And today's terrorism is wide organization and with state-like structures. At the beginning and the mid-20th century, it was performed mostly by marginal groups. Today, terrorist organizations are rich organizations with well-established economy. Terrorism in mid-century, last century, was mostly driven by some kind of idealism. Today, terrorism is professional and connected with organized crime. Terrorism from the mid-20th century was with limited political goals, and today terrorism has global ambitions. It wishes not only to change policy of particular states, like it was in last century, but it has ambition to change global society. Conflict of different but limited political concepts was characteristic of previous terrorism, and today it has ambition to provoke clash and war of civilization. That's the goal. And then some probably not only technical differences. In last century, communication between terrorists and public opinion was relatively primitive and simple. Today, modern communications make a new platform that is very professionally used by terrorists. What are crucial or main rights and values attached to democratic society of 20th and 21st century? We have to respect several important rights. A right to live, right to have decent life. We have to respect freedom, free speech, right to privacy, home, communication, family life, right to some procedural rights, especially faced with criminal charges, right to fair trial. And of course, there is global value, it's democracy as we understand them in mostly all, not only Western, but some other countries as well. But we have to understand that those rights are not only constitutional rights of different countries. Those rights are also part of international law. Let's just remember Charter of Human Rights, or one very efficient system, it's European Court of Human Rights that's watching over human rights literally daily. And of course now we have to think how to adapt our thinking of human rights. How should Grammys like Court of Human Rights or our local courts and the Constitutional Court act faced with terrorism and need to somehow to restrict some of those rights in fighting terrorism. Definitely classical approach as it was present during first period of century and even till 80s, it's not applicable anymore, unfortunately. So what should be restriction, or what are the restrictions that can be allowed? There are some human rights that cannot be diminished. You can easily recognize it from European human rights conventions. But definitely some experiences show us what were good and what was the bad practice. One very important challenge was experience of Guantanamo. Unfortunately, I have to stress that this experience was not a good one. Especially it was not good because practice of United States of America involved new category of persons in international law. When someone is deprived of freedom It can be under criminal charges, or it's prison of war. But Americans invented new category of people, people who are outlaws. They are not accused in criminal procedure, and they are not prisoner of the war. That means people without any rights. And I think it's bad for fight against terrorism, because somehow it shows that democratic society could be with same tools as undemocratic societies, unfortunately. Secondly, during the fight of terrorism, definitely torture was applied. That's something that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable because if we are the similar as terrorists, what is the difference? And one of global goals of terrorism is to challenge values of democratic society. I had the opportunity to be in United States before 11th and after. And that's not the similar society. You cannot enter any bar without ID, night bar, or whatever. So the fear is present. Not only United States, in Europe as well, in my country as well, in spite we didn't have terrorism like in some other country, fortunately, yet. So I think we should not follow the main wish of terrorism to change our society. We should keep our profile as democratic society. Then we have special measures that must be approved by fight against terrorism. It's control of finances. It was never before that my private or your private banking accounts are always, in every second, transparent, not only to my government, but to some other governments. We can understand what is behind, but some kind of safeguards should be put parallelly with those measures. Then we have control of communications. Unfortunately, it was very clear from the practice of democratic countries that they're tap wiring not only suspects for terrorism, but also wide circle of people. Always telling that it's part of fight against terrorism. That's not a good one. And then a new very important challenge is internet. We have to be aware of the fact that internet is heavily misused by terrorists, especially so-called dark internet. Daily, they send messages to each other, planning terrorist acts, having communication, misusing this relatively new way of global communication. So I think that from one side we have to really follow what's going on internet, but also to have some safeguards not to misuse this measure. Of course, populism makes decision to leaders easy. It's very easy after creation of public opinion that we have to stop terrorism. Yes, we have to stop terrorism to involve appropriate measures. So democratic society should have a very strict control over new measures rising traditional human rights. Because after populism, after an appropriate measure, we have to wake up in the morning and to recognize that those measures are also touching not only, or not mostly, not only terrorists, but ordinary people as well, diminishing our human rights values. What should be done? There is now today a very difficult task for leaders, especially in those countries on the front line in fight of terrorism. Firstly, they have to involve and include really all necessary measures, breaks in democratic society in accordance with law to prevent and fight terrorism. Of course, that asks from them to invent and to follow what's going on and to react really properly, because even a second of non-appropriate behavior of the government can be priced by many human lives. And from the other side, it looks completely contrary. They have to preserve democratic standards as much as possible. So it's very important to establish a legal framework for states and for leaders to find proper approach to terrorism. In internal law, of course, adoption of new laws, always having in mind not only danger of terrorism, but also need to keep human rights. That means new code on criminal procedure. That means anti-terrorist law, financial laws, informational laws, and of course, probably in some countries, even constitution is needed to be adopted for efficient fight against terrorism. In the field of international law, firstly, full cooperation of states in fighting terrorism is really necessary. Not only judicial bodies, but intelligence services should cooperate properly, not having some hidden agenda, but really fighting against terrorism. I think sanctions for all countries supporting terrorism should be involved. All countries, literally all countries. And something that's new, I think that mandatory competence of ICJ, International Court of Justice, for disputes between states connected to terrorism should be involved. And finally, universal jurisdiction for crimes of terrorism should be respected and practiced in all countries. So definitely this first dilemma, should someone be remembered as someone who destroyed democracy or someone who saved democratic society, will be easier to be resolved in favor of positive answer for our leaders if some of those measures are considered. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your intervention, in particular, this comparison you established between terrorism in the 20th century and terrorism in the 21st century, between the small and the big, the poor and the rich, the local and the global, and many other distinctions that, in fact, deserve comments and round tables to go through them. Again, thank you very much for the light you shed on the effects of the transparency in black accounts, in bank accounts, and how to deal with the dark internet. A point, a very important and basic point that the President has mentioned, has stressed, is the change in Europe, the change in America. And I would add to that, the change in the Middle East, the change in the third world. Indeed, there is a major change going on for different reasons. We will come to that later in order not to disturb the order of the speakers. The third speaker is President Amin Gemayel, President of Lebanon from 1982 to 1988. President Gemayel is part of the history of Lebanon and one of the major figures still in the politics of Lebanon and our region. I give him the floor. Where did he go? even if he is outside, he still plays a major role in Lebanon and Lebanese history. So will you call President Jumail to come? Okay. President Stoyanov, Peter Stoyanov, has agreed to speak now, and then we'll postpone the intervention of President Jumail for later. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be together with you and the other honorable guests to discuss this very, very important topic. My thanks to the organizers of this conference for everything they have done. Thank you. So, terrorism and constitutional rights, I think this is maybe one of the most important topics of our day. I have a legal background. I used to be a lawyer before I took the presidential office in Bulgaria. You forgot to say how important a role I also played for my country, Bulgaria, but okay, we're friends.
You know, I am programmed, so I was ready to introduce you as the fourth speaker.
It is a joke. It is a joke.
So, but I will do that again.
So, terrorism and constitutional rights. Let me start with an example, explaining how delicate the topic we're discussing today is. As a result of the horrible attacks in the middle of November last year, in Paris were killed 130 people. France was shocked, not only because it was the third major terrorist attack in Paris in year, after Charlie Hebdo and after the terrorist attacks against the Jewish supermarket, but also because many of those who carried out the attacks were French citizens. More than 3 million people demonstrated on the streets across France against terrorism, seeking for severe measures against the perpetrators of that. People wonder at times who we are, as French people, as a nation, Prime Minister Manuel Valls said. And in response, President Hollande proposed radical changes to enhance security, including the measure to strip some convicted terrorists of their citizenship, and to expand emergency powers, such as to conduct warrantless searches and order house arrests. Both measures required changes to France's constitution. Although the measures had public support in the aftermath of the deadly attacks, the debate quickly became heated, very, very heated. Critics pointed to history when the French citizenship of Jews and members of the resistance was stripped by the Vichy government. Even the reaction of the justice minister was stripping citizenship from people born French raises a substantial problem on a fundamental principle, the right of soil. Legal experts, on the other hand, pointed out that international treaty obligations prevent states from stripping people of the citizenships if it makes them stateless. So, to get around this, the French government proposed stripping only those convicted terrorists who possessed dual citizenship. For example, Moroccan and French citizenship, Algerian and French citizenship. As a response, one of the prominent French historian and political scientist, Patrick Well, said, "We are creating two categories of citizens in our constitution." In the end of March 2016, President François Hollande dropped the proposed constitutional changes after it became absolutely clear that it would not be approved by the parliament. Parts of the opposition have been hostile to a revision of the constitution, President Hollande said, and added, "I deplore this attitude. I have decided to end this debate." So, this debate actually was ended not just because of the reaction of the opposition, but also because of the reaction of many civil activists, public figures, NGO representatives, human rights defenders, legal experts, etc., etc. But it illustrates very well how important and at the same time how sensitive this question is. Should we expand the governmental powers at the expense of curtailing some of the constitutional rights of our citizens in the war against terrorism? This is the main question. The usual answer is that we have to strike the right balance between the effective anti-terrorist measures and protecting human rights. Let me, however, say some words beyond that. I believe that we should be very careful using the simple balanced rhetoric when formulating and implementing legal measures to counter the threat of international terrorism. The use of impressive metaphors should never become a substitute for sound reasoning, sensible decision-making, and effective policy work. The academic, political, and public discourse on counter-terrorism law and policy has frequently revolved around the idea that a balance must be struck between civil liberties and the interests of national security. However, this idea could be problematic because of some interrelated reasons. First, the simple balancing approach doesn't give an adequate consideration to the philosophical and conceptual basis of the notions of liberty and security. Because liberty is a precondition of security, liberty is closely related to security, and the two goods cannot logically be balanced against each other. And the judge knows that very well, even better than me. Secondly, there are major rights-based objections to a simple balancing exercise. This includes the jurisprudential problem of whether and to what extent civil liberties can be balanced against community interests. Thirdly, commentators invoking the balance metaphor to justify new security laws to counter the immediate dangers posed by terrorism, they don't give appropriate weight to the long-term consequences of curtailing fundamental rights and liberties. Because despite delivering some possible short-term gains in security, some countermeasures may actually increase the potential for terrorism and diminish security in the long run. But on the other hand, some security experts point out that a terrorist emergency is precisely a case where allowing individual liberty to plan attacks, to plot, to evade detection may threaten a vital majority interest that is a national security. So this could be called the catch-22 of the liberal democratic state response to terrorism, if we make use of the Joseph Heller's world-famous novel. This controversy raises serious debate. What measures must a state be willing to undertake in order to secure its own survival? What are the limits of state responses to security threats? Should national security prevail over civil liberties and constitutional rights of our citizens? Where should the line be drawn? Do emergency legislation restricting civil liberties defend or attack democracy? Are there a threat to the quality of democracy or a necessary measure to guarantee state security? A number of Western democracies have already, in the wake of 9/11, changed their laws. The British government has outlawed the glorification of terrorism and authorized the indefinite detention and deportation of terrorism suspects. Italy, the Netherlands, and France have authorized increased surveillance and wiretapping, and Germany introduced legislation that permits the government to have greater access to individual financial records. In the history of the United States, the American commitment to civil liberties has frequently been put to the test. And despite of that, after 9/11, President George Bush's counterterrorism agenda has drawn a lot of criticism. We have to acknowledge that a number of the actions taken by the administration in its war on terrorism present genuine threats to the individual rights of American citizens and of foreign citizens caught up in the counterterrorism net. At the same time, it is important to point out that the setbacks to individual rights during the war on terrorism pose less severe threats to American liberty than those that arose during the major conflicts of the past. We have to remember the measures of American administration just after the Pearl Harbor attack during the Second World War. It is important to underline that the American civil society has tempered a number of the administration's more ambitious initiatives and has had an important impact on the shape of America's counterterrorism regime. That explains that everywhere democratic nations grapple with the tension between preserving cherished liberties and protecting themselves from the very real threat of terrorism. One thing is sure, as terrorism is an international threat, it requires a global response. Sorry, it sounds as a cliche, but that is the truth. There is a need to adhere to the relevant Security Council resolutions and the International Terrorism Conventions. Let me mention the very important recent United Nations Security Council resolution 2322, adopted in December last year, 2016, aiming to strengthen international judicial cooperation in the fight against terrorism. I think it is very important we have to use same measures, same standards. By it, the Security Council underlined the importance of strengthening international cooperation, including by investigators, prosecutors, and judges, in order to prevent, investigate, and prosecute terrorist acts. The Council called upon all states to consider establishing appropriate laws and mechanisms that allow for the broadest possible international cooperation. So, at present, the state institutions of the major democracies continue to grapple with the issue raised by the counterterrorism agenda, especially the assertion of enhanced authority by the governments. At the same time, the proposition that counterterrorism policies are placing fundamental freedoms in jeopardy and leading to massive violation of civil liberties seems to be an overstatement of current conditions, especially when viewed in historical context. It is clear that the new kind of terrorism committed to the mass murder of civilians is forcing democratic societies around the world to consider adjustments in both the law and the techniques of national security. And throughout Europe, I'm coming from Europe, Bulgaria is a member of the European Union, and throughout Europe, democratic governments have responded to the terrorist threat by tightening anti-terrorism laws, France, Germany, the Netherlands, expanding the surveillance powers of states, adding restrictions to the asylum and immigration process, and enabling the deportation of immigrants who through action or word seem to support terrorism. While it will take some time to establish the proper relationship between security and liberty in an age of terrorism, current trends suggest that the democracies in the Euro-Atlantic area will successfully or relatively successfully meet the current challenge. Thank you very much. Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. As usual, always convincing as an international, recognized international lawyer. I would
Thank you very much.
I would wish to underline part of what you have said about catch-22 of the liberal democratic state response to terrorism, which raises a serious debate. What measures must a state be willing to undertake in order to secure its own survival? What are the limits of state responses to security threats? Should national security prevail over civil liberties? Where should the line be drawn? Then, do emergency legislations restricting civil liberties defend or attack democracy? Very relevant questions that do call on us to reflect on those issues. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, President Amin Gemayel of Lebanon, please.
He used to be a lawyer before.
I would like first to express my sincere thanks to the Ganjavi Foundation and my friend Ismail Serageldin, head of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, organizing this important high-level meeting on the theme Democratic Security in a Time of Extremism and Violence. In my brief remarks, I hope to share some reflections on the twin threats of extremism and violence and suggest some possible remedies to them in the fields of education reform, economic development, and improved governance. And most crucially, in the context of our present consultations, I would like to look at the critical role of democracy in meeting the grave challenges we face globally, regionally, and within so many countries around the world. It takes no great leap of imagination or analyst to conclude that the world community is today buffeted by the twin threats of extremism and violence. Most dramatically in the Middle East, a so-called Islamic State has seized control over a vast, although now contracting, self-declared caliphate devoted to exporting chaos. The established democracies of Europe and North America are not immune to internal extremism and violence. In the United States, the phenomenon of lone wolf attacks is a rising danger, while Europe is a seemingly unstoppable series of spectacular terrorist strikes continue. Terrorism, in short, has become a foremost threat to international, national, and human security. To gain a necessary and broader view of our predicament, we must begin by grasping that the threats of extremism and violence are not new, even if their scope and tempo dramatically increased in the years since the 9/11 attacks against the United States. With respect to the modern phenomenon of terrorism, and in particular terrorism inspired and sustained by religious extremism, no country is more painfully attuned to its destabilizing effects than mine, Lebanon. Lebanese officials, as far back as 1980s, tried to warn the world what would happen if the problem were not dealt with comprehensively and on a multilateral basis. Turning to more recent history, we can state that since 2001, the international community has implemented a range of responses to terrorism, but unfortunately these exertions have not prevented either the geographic spread or increased lethality of extremism. In light of this reality, I would now like to speak for a few moments about some remedies that could help move the Middle East away from the prevailing politics of turmoil and toward a new positive stability. If the Arab peoples are to defeat extremism and violence, then we require a range of non-lethal solutions to supplement and ultimately supplant the lethal remedies that have so far predominated under the slogan, war on terror. In my view, the Arab world must address 4 key areas. The first, enhancing the role of Arab youth through a comprehensive program of education reform, especially to improve quality and access at all levels. Second, reducing poverty through socio-economic development, which will eliminate a perpetual source of instability and extremism. Third, establishing accountability in governance, in part by adopting the kind of checks and balances that prevent dangerous concentration of power. And fourth, partnering with the new media to foster a culture of democracy. In the limited time we have, I would like to address the vital dimension of governance. From my perspective, Arabs are confronted today by 3 competing realities of governance: the old and bankrupt failed states, the dangerous Islamic State, and what can be called citizen states. I submit that over the long term, only strong support for human rights, pluralism, and democracy, as practiced by citizen states, can stabilize individual Arab societies and, over time, the Middle East region as a whole. What is the definition of a citizen state? A citizen state, in my view, is one in which the following elements, among for sure others, apply. 1, the well-being of the individual is paramount. 2, politics and religion are separated. 3, executive governance is transparent, respectful of dissent, and media scrutiny and accountable to parliamentary control. 4, elections at all levels are free and competitive. 5, the judiciary is independent. 6, pluralism flourishes in the form of gender equality, religious tolerance, autonomous civil society, and cultural expression. The bedrock principles of citizen states are democracy and good governance. How can we promote these concepts within an Arab context? If at this historical moment prospects for the triumph of Arab democracy appear grim, then we, as analysts, must also concede that global democracy has in recent years entered a crisis period. Democracy's position appeared to be very different at the turn of the 21st century. At that time, democracy appeared as a surging wave that would not break. The recent collapse of the Soviet Union seemingly secured democracy in Europe for the long time. Democracy, for the most part, had spread throughout Latin America and was making significant progress in Asia. Only Africa and the Middle East lagged behind in terms of democratization. Fortunately, prominent examples from Arab countries provide hope that key political and religious circles are beginning to embrace democratic precepts. Here in Cairo, for instance, in June 2011, for example, Grand Imam Dr. Ahmed al-Tayyib, Sheikh of the prestigious Al-Azhar, the world's leading center of Sunni Muslim thought, issued a significant declaration on democracy. The statement reads in part, and I quote, Al-Azhar embraces democracy based on free and direct voting. Islamic precepts include pluralism, rotation of power, monitoring performance, seeking people's public interest in all legislation and decisions, ruling the state in accordance with its laws, combating corruption, and ensuring the accountability of all people. End of quote. Given the centrality of Islam in the Middle East, the movement for Arab democracy and constitutionalism must remain attuned to Muslim understandings of these concepts. This can be done in part by engaging and building on the perspectives articulated by Al-Azhar. It's a very important document. Here I should also like to mention a chart that I drafted and issued in January 2012 during a conference held in Lebanon. Among its key provisions, the charter endorses a strong civil state, upholds the inviolability of freedom, supports gender equality in all spheres of life, and affirms religious, ethnic, and political pluralism. The challenge for the people of the Middle East at this crucial moment in history is to demonstrate that we are capable of achieving pluralism, freedom, and modernity. Now is the time for our troubled region to transcend intolerance in all its forms, whether religious or political, and define a concept of citizenship based on universal values of democracy. In conclusion, amid the Middle East region, characterized by chaos and conflict of biblical proportions, I've tried to sound an optimistic note. I have tried to sound an optimistic note. I have done this because I truly believe that the future of the Arab peoples is bright. Amid the daily parade of disasters that we read about or experience directly, we must not forget that the country narrative exists, even if it receives less attention than it deserves. This is the story of the Middle East as a zone of growth. In fact, remarkable growth in key indicators like human capital, entrepreneurial spirit, information technology, and natural resources. Any optimistic assessment of democracy and constitutionalism in the Arab world today must take note of positive developments in some countries like Lebanon or Tunisia and many others. In Tunisia, the very birthplace of the Arab awakening. Finally, I would like to conclude with a proposal that could help generalize the positive experiences across the Arab world. I would like to propose for discussion the formation of a Center on Arab Democracy, comprised of prominent Arab scholars, thought leaders, both secular and religious. This Center on Arab Democracy would have as its mandate to the formulation of a consensus Arab view on democracy and good governance. Such a center would also map out the dynamics and details of a partnership between the established Atlantic democracies and emerging Arab democracy. In this way, the center could help recapture and refocus the fleeting consensus on the Arab Spring and help contribute substantively to the achievement of peace, prosperity, and democracy in the Middle East. I firmly believe that democracy is the future of our region, and that the chaos of today will be followed by the dawn of progress, guided by the star of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, President Jumail, and thank you for striking this note of optimism, and that the future of the Arab world rests on the process of democracy, which I do share fully with you. I also wish to underline the 4 points you have enumerated, or you have affirmed, to make this future a sure future. That's about the role of the youth, combating poverty, checks and balances on government actions, and the media positive role, and how to bring it back from the very perilous path of today.
And you have to work together on the Center of Arab Democracy.
I'm coming to that, Mr. President.
You have a role.
I'm coming to that, Mr. President. You also gave us 3 categories of government. Old governments, that is the corrupt, the Islamic State government, which is no government, and the citizens' government, with several elements you have underlined, and I believe this is a very interesting point, in addition to what you have mentioned about the role of Al-Azhar, quoting the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, talking about democracy, about public opinion, and about different opinions. Finally, the proposal on the suggestion concerning the formation of Arab Democracy Center is indeed an idea worth seriously considering. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now I wish to give we have finished with the 4 speakers, but I believe the rapporteur wishes to, you don't? Excuse me?
There is one more.
Dr. Twiji, of course. Yes. This is a good addition, and I really wait to listen to Dr. Twiji, who is the Secretary General of the Organization of Scientific Literature and Art of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. He's an old hand and a very prominent official from Saudi Arabia. I give him the floor.
دولة المملكة السعودية. Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be speaking in Arabic because we are here now in Egypt, or ancient Egypt, that preserved the Arabic language and protected it. And we are in Cairo, the capital of the Arab people that protected and faced the challenges facing the sovereignty and dignity of the state. It's my pleasure to talk to you today and participate in the meeting in this Nizami Janjawi International Center and Bibliotheca Alexandria high-level meeting on democratic security in a time of extremism and violence. I'd like also to thank my two friends, Dr. Ismail Serageldin, head of Bibliotheca Alexandria, and my friend Rusha Maradov, the General Director of Nizami Janjawi, for inviting me to participate with the political and electoral leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, in fact, this is the issue we are discussing today is a very important issue due to its complexity, which requires striking a balance between adherence to the rules of law and the requirement of rule of law and ensuring the conditions conducive to the enforcement of law and countering extremism and violence on the other hand. So, this balance, the policies aimed at protecting human communities against the crisis associated with the spread of political and criminal crimes that their inherent threats to public security and must maintain a certain equilibrium between the powers legally vested in government and the rights of individuals and groups as guaranteed by national constitutions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this equation should be summarized as follows. So, whether the crucial need for maintaining securities and fighting penal or political crimes would justify the violation of constitutions and laws because of the security needs? Basically, democracy requires that the governments should abide by constitutions and the laws enforced under any circumstances in their societies. Such a commitment to democracy is a prerequisite for overcoming crises and times of hardships. This requires enforcing the law in conformity with the Constitution and the relevant legal procedures, without sacrificing democracy by overlooking the constitutional and legal provisions regulating the lives of individuals and communities, because this would only encourage the outlaws and undermine stability and exacerbate extremism and violence. The enforcement of laws to counter extremism, which feeds violence and terrorism, will virtually deter extremist groups from being involved in terrorist actions and threatening the stability and securities of societies. So, while dealing with extremists involved in terrorist acts as masterminds, active agents, or overindulged zealots. So, we need to understand that the rule of law is far more powerful than the spite of terrorism and will eventually prevail no matter how long the battle between good and evil would take. Following this line of thought, which calls for disgracing democratic principles in fighting extremism, violence, and terrorism, will certainly have adverse consequences. It will only undermine confidence in constitutions and laws, lure more autocratic regimes into crossing the red lines beyond which democracy would be empty of all significance, and lead societies into a spiral of violence and counter-violence. Choosing democratic security in a time of extremism and violence as a theme for this meeting is of great importance and deep significance. Obviously, any substitute for democratic security would, by definition, be anti-democratic and will accordingly override the Constitution and the laws in force and manipulate them for their own interests in such a way as to justify the security measures taken to this end. This is a dangerous and uncalculated gamble that would never pay off, as it would neither end extremism and violence nor eradicate terrorism. Our world today is engaged in a fierce fight against the imminent dangers looming over world security and peace. Violent extremism has gained unprecedented ground among individuals and groups, and has been permeated some governments that practice state terrorism or harbor terrorist organizations under all sorts of pretexts. It has thus become a global phenomenon, as it has come to be called by strategists and international law experts. But the more serious the danger associated with the spread of terrorist acts in numerous parts of the world, the more urgent the need for enforcing human rights and the rule of law when dealing with this phenomenon. Amid today's so-called war on terrorism, this necessity is more persistent than ever, and this war waged on terrorism should in no way justify a corollary assault on human rights, for this would end up being counterproductive, with extremely serious consequences on human communities, which will thus plunge into a cycle of wars undermining world security and peace. At a time of widespread extremism and violence, and at this stage marked by the so-called war on terrorism, a state of confusion and conflicting interests prevails, which requires extreme caution in every step to be taken and deep understanding of the complexities of the regional and international contexts and alliances in the Middle East and its vicinity. At any rate, human dignity should be placed above all else. The human rights guaranteed everywhere, including people's rights to choose their own destinies, protect their lands, and live in security, peace, justice, freedom, and dignity under international law. It should be guaranteed. So, and the international law should be a fair judge between all the peoples. So it's heart-rending to witness that the standing conflicts in the region have evolved into civil wars that have taken a sectarian turn, playing into the hands of regional and international powers at the expense of hundreds of thousands of innocent lives and millions of displaced and homeless people, as in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, or have else gone tribal, as in Libya and Somalia. So security, peace, so all the links between the components of the society are now disrupted. So security, peace, and democracy can only be restored in these countries by respecting the will of their peoples and refraining from meddling in their own affairs by imposing authoritarian and repressive regimes on them, or subjecting them to the hegemony of a particular sectarian or ethnic groups. Democracy consists in respecting the will of the peoples to decide who will run their affairs and protect their interests. And one of the fundamental prerequisites for a successful democracy is the enforcement of the rule of law and the supremacy of constitutions under all circumstances. Thanks a lot.
شكرا الدكتور عبد العزيز تويجري.
Thanks, Mr. Abdelaziz Twigri,
النقاط المهمة
and
التي
thanks
ركز
for
عليها
the points that he focused on,
وبخاصة
especially
ما ذكره من
what
أن
he stated
الغلبة سوف
about
تكون
the
للقانون في كل
rule
الظروف
of law
مهما
under
تأخر
any
التوصل إلى ذلك.
circumstances.
ثم
Then,
قولته التي
talking about
أعتقد أنها سوف تكون
something that's
شهيرة
very
أن
important,
الديمقراطية
that
لا يجب
democracy
أن تكون اسما
shouldn't be
بلا
a
جسم،
name without
وأن
a real
منطق
texture,
الحرب
and
المعلنة على
that the
الإرهاب
war
لا
against
يجب
terrorism
أن تشمل حربا
shouldn't
على حقوق
include
الإنسان.
a war on human rights.
وأن البديل للأمن
And that the
الديمقراطي
alternative
الذي هو
for
عنوان
democratic
هذه
securities, that's the theme of this
هذه
discussion.
الجلسة، هو الأمن الذي
The
لا
alternative
يلتزم
is the
بالدستور
security
ولا
that
بالقانون
doesn't
ومن
abide by
ثم
the law and the
تسود
constitution, and the
و-
chaos will prevail and the peoples, individuals and citizens
السيدات
will be
والسادة،
harmed. Ladies and
بهذا
gentlemen, thus
تنتهي
this
قائمة
session,
المتحدثين
the list
في
of
هذه
speakers
الجلسة،
in this session
والجلسة القادمة
ends, and the
سوف
next
تبدأ
session will
فورياً
start immediately
دون
with no
لحظات استراحة
breaks.
وإنما